November 20th marks Transgender Day of Remembrance, annual vigil honoring trans lives lost to violence, while gay male allies stand alongside trans community, proving that authentic solidarity requires showing up for our most vulnerable members, rather than abandoning them when supporting trans rights becomes politically inconvenient or commercially risky for cisgender members enjoying relative privilege. These aren't performative allies posting rainbow flags once yearly. These are gay men using platforms, resources, and visibility, advocating for trans community facing systematic violence that claimed hundreds of lives this year alone. Deaths that society ignores through calculated indifference, treating trans existence as disposable when their humanity threatens systems requiring rigid gender conformity as control mechanism over bodies that refuse performing assigned categories. From Coleman Domingo connecting Bayard Rustin to Black trans lives, to George Takei comparing trans persecution to Japanese internment, to Dan Levy's Met Gala tribute to AIDS activism, to Sam Smith's non-binary visibility supporting broader trans community, November 20th demonstrates that cisgender allies must translate privilege into material support rather than remaining silent when trans siblings face violence that systematic discrimination enables through ongoing scapegoating. Number 3 founded initiative supporting trans youth mental health. Number 1's TDUR speeches connect civil rights history to current trans persecution. Which allies' advocacy matters most? Subscribe because trans liberation requires cisgender solidarity. Not just during Pride, but especially during November, when we remember those we've lost to violence that society enables through systematic indifference. 1. Coleman Domingo, connecting civil rights to trans liberation. Coleman Domingo leads November 20th. Transgender Day of Remembrance vigils connecting his Bayard Rustin portrayal to Black trans lives, demonstrating that civil rights legacy demands intersectional solidarity rather than selective advocacy, protecting only cisgender community members while abandoning trans siblings facing violence that systematic discrimination enables through calculated scapegoating. His January 2024 interview explicitly connected Rustin to Black trans liberation. Coleman stated, "If it's about Black Lives Matter, we have to do this together. We have to include Black trans lives," demonstrating understanding that liberation isn't menu where cisgender people select which oppressed groups deserve support based on personal comfort or political convenience, when authentic solidarity requires defending most vulnerable members. Here's what makes Coleman's trans advocacy particularly powerful beyond performative allyship. He's two-time Oscar nominee, 2024 Rustin, 2025 Sing Sing, using massive platform amplifying trans voices rather than simply posting supportive statements, then returning to career focus, treating advocacy as occasional hobby rather than sustained commitment requiring ongoing resource investment and visibility utilization. The June 2025 Native Son Awards honored him alongside other Black queer leaders, recognition demonstrating how his advocacy serves community through consistent showing up rather than occasional high-profile statements. Coleman's work spans racial healing, civil rights education, and LGBTQ+ visibility, proving that intersectional activism requires addressing multiple systematic oppressions simultaneously, rather than compartmentalizing struggles as if discrimination operates independently. But his Rustin role provided historical framework connecting past civil rights struggles to current trans persecution. Bayard Rustin faced systematic exclusion from civil rights movement leadership despite organizing March on Washington. His homosexuality used discrediting him when homophobia served movement leaders wanting respectability over authentic inclusion. Today's trans exclusion mirrors that historical pattern where marginalized groups sacrifice most vulnerable members seeking mainstream acceptance. The November speeches he delivers at TDUR vigils emphasize that Black trans women face disproportionate violence. His consistent messaging connects racial and gender-based discrimination, demonstrating understanding that Black trans people navigate multiple systematic oppressions, simultaneously requiring solidarity from cisgender Black community and white trans community, both of whom sometimes abandon Black trans people through prioritizing single-axis identities over intersectional realities. His social media platform amplifies trans voices year-round rather than only during November visibility moments. Coleman regularly shares trans activists' work, fundraisers for trans organizations, and educational content about trans experiences, proving that authentic allyship requires sustained visibility beyond single annual commemoration when violence occurs daily, requiring ongoing advocacy rather than occasional performative support. But here's where Coleman's advocacy becomes model for cisgender ally responsibility. He doesn't center himself in trans liberation conversations. He uses platform amplifying trans people's own voices rather than speaking for community when actual trans people should lead their own advocacy. This approach demonstrates understanding that allyship means supporting rather than leading, when communities fighting for their own liberation need resources and visibility, more than cisgender saviors claiming to speak on their behalf. The Native Son Awards recognition, alongside Dr. David J. Johns and others, demonstrated community acknowledgement. Coleman's consistent advocacy earned respect from activists who distinguish between performative allies seeking credit and genuine supporters investing resources, risking comfort, and maintaining commitment when visibility doesn't provide immediate personal benefit or career advancement. Today, Coleman Domingo's November 20th TDOR leadership connects civil rights legacy to trans liberation, demonstrating that authentic solidarity requires cisgender allies defending most vulnerable community members facing violence that systematic discrimination enables through ongoing scapegoating society tolerates through calculated indifference, treating trans existence as disposable drop-a-one. If you think Coleman Domingo's TDOR advocacy proves that civil rights legacy demands intersectional solidarity and that cisgender allies must defend trans community. 2. George Takei, comparing internment to trans persecution. George Takei draws explicit parallels between his childhood Japanese internment and current trans persecution. 88-year-old Star Trek icon using personal trauma, educating audiences about how scapegoating operates across different marginalized communities when governments need enemies, distracting from actual problems requiring systematic solutions. In his August 2023 essay, The Ugly Danger of Scapegoating, Connected Internment to Anti-Trans Legislation, George wrote about being forced from home at gunpoint along with 125,000 Japanese Americans rendered destitute, then held without charge or trial behind barbed wire, demonstrating how governments weaponize fear against vulnerable populations when political leaders need proving they're tough on manufactured threats, distracting voters from economic inequality and institutional corruption. Here's what makes George's comparison particularly powerful for understanding trans persecution patterns. He explained that President Franklin D. Roosevelt needed proving toughness on Japanese following Pearl Harbor, creating enemy population that Americans could blame for war anxiety when actual threats were complex, requiring nuanced responses rather than simple scapegoating. Today's politicians similarly need proving they're protecting children from trans people, manufacturing crisis where none exists because actual child welfare issues like poverty, healthcare access, and education funding require difficult, systematic solutions. The November TDOR speeches he delivers emphasize learning from history. George consistently states, as someone who experienced forced relocation as a child, the sense of déjà vu is deeply unsettling, demonstrating how survivors of one genocide recognize warning signs of others when scapegoating patterns repeat across different targeted populations using identical fear-mongering rhetoric, treating marginalized people as threats requiring governmental elimination. But his December 2024 social media statement became viral. Rallying cry, more than ever, we must stand by our trans family and support them, hold space for them, and insist the scapegoating and targeting stop now. Demonstrating understanding that allyship requires active defense rather than passive sympathy when trans community faces systematic persecution requiring cisgender allies risking comfort defending people who mainstream society treats as acceptable targets. The Lambda Legal West Coast Liberty Awards, September 2024, honored George alongside Dylan Mulvaney, recognition pairing elder statesman activist with young trans creator facing systematic harassment. This generational connection demonstrated how sustained advocacy spans decades when commitment transcends momentary visibility into lifelong dedication. serving communities facing ongoing persecution regardless of whether defending them remains politically popular. His marriage equality advocacy precedent informed trans rights work. George fought for marriage equality decades before legal victory, demonstrating understanding that rights battles require sustained commitment spanning years when progress isn't linear but involves setbacks requiring persistent advocacy despite discouragement when victories seem impossible. But here's where George's comparison becomes crucial for understanding persecution mechanics. Internment happened because most Americans didn't challenge it and Supreme Court signed off, demonstrating how discrimination becomes normalized when majority population accepts scapegoating rather than defending targeted minorities. Today's anti-trans legislation similarly depends on cisgender silence, enabling persecution that vocal opposition could prevent through sustained political pressure and social accountability. The Star Trek legacy adds cultural weight to his advocacy. George's Sulu character represented future where diversity was normalized, his real-life activism attempts creating that future through defending communities facing current persecution when science fiction's optimistic vision requires present-day work building inclusive society rather than simply imagining it fictionally. His age, 88, demonstrates that advocacy is lifelong commitment. George didn't retire from activism after achieving personal success. He continues fighting for marginalized communities decades after his own liberation, proving that authentic solidarity requires ongoing work rather than stopping once personal oppression ends. Today, George Takei's November TDR advocacy connects Japanese internment to trans persecution, demonstrating how scapegoating operates across different targeted populations and that cisgender allies must learn from history rather than allowing persecution repeating through remaining silent when speaking up could prevent violence. 3. Dan Levy, Met Gala. Tribute and ongoing trans support. Dan Levy's 2021 Met Gala outfit, honoring AIDS activist David Wojnarowicz, established his commitment to intersectional advocacy. Schitt's Creek creator wearing Lowy costume depicting two men kissing while supporting visual aids, demonstrating understanding that trans liberation connects to broader queer history, requiring remembering those lost to systematic violence and governmental indifference. The May 2023 GLAAD Gala speech following National Transgender Visibility March solidified his trans advocacy. Dan stated, "It was a small way of paying back the generosity that had been shown to me, while at the same time creating space on television for queer characters that I could relate to. Demonstrating understanding that representation creates visibility, enabling others seeing themselves when previous generations lacked role models that current performers have responsibility providing." Here's what makes Dan's trans support particularly significant beyond generic allyship. His Schitt's Creek featured David Rose as television's first openly pansexual character, creating representation, normalizing sexual fluidity that benefits trans community by challenging rigid gender and sexuality categories that society weaponizes against anyone refusing heteronormative conformity. The November TDR involvement spans multiple years, demonstrating sustained commitment. Dan doesn't only show up during June Pride when supporting community is commercially beneficial. His November presence at vigils honoring trans murder victims proves that authentic allyship means supporting community during grief rather than only celebrating during moments of joy when visibility provides positive publicity. But his fundraising initiatives demonstrate material support beyond statements. Dan's Indigenous Education fundraising, matching donations up to $25,000, and birthday campaigns raising $50,000 for University of Alberta Native Studies program prove that authentic advocacy requires financial commitment backing visibility with resources when marginalized communities need material support beyond inspiring social media posts. The Human Rights Campaign Visibility Award, March 2020, and GLAAD Award recognized his media representation work. Dan's consistent creation of authentic queer content spanning Schitt's Creek, Good Grief, and other projects demonstrates understanding that visibility matters for all marginalized communities, including trans people who rarely see themselves represented in mainstream media beyond tragedy narratives. His social media advocacy addresses current anti-trans legislation. Dan regularly speaks out against laws targeting trans youth, using platform with millions of followers amplifying trans voices and sharing resources for supporting community facing systematic persecution through governmental scapegoating that cisgender allies must vocally oppose. But here's where Dan's advocacy becomes model for celebrity allyship, requiring action beyond statements. He donates to organizations, amplifies trans voices, creates inclusive content, speaks at events, and uses platform consistently rather than performatively, proving that authentic solidarity requires ongoing commitment, utilizing privilege and resources supporting community-facing violence that cisgender people avoid through identity privilege. The Schitt's Creek legacy of "a place where everybody fits in" informed his approach to trans advocacy. Dan's creation of fictional inclusive space demonstrated belief in actual inclusive society. His real-life advocacy attempts building that world rather than simply imagining it through entertainment, when representation alone doesn't prevent violence requiring systematic change through political advocacy and cultural transformation. His Canadian identity adds international dimension. Demonstrating trans persecution isn't uniquely American. Dan's work in Canada and US proves that anti-trans discrimination crosses borders, requiring global solidarity rather than treating persecution as isolated national issue. When transphobia operates internationally through coordinated conservative movements targeting trans people worldwide. Today, Dan Levy's November TDUR participation and ongoing trans support demonstrates that authentic allyship requires sustained commitment beyond performative statements. His work proves that cisgender allies must utilize platforms, resources, and visibility, supporting trans community facing violence rather than remaining silent when advocacy becomes politically risky. Drop a 3 if you think Dan Levy's ongoing trans support proves that authentic allyship requires sustained commitment beyond performative statements, and that cisgender allies must utilize platforms and resources supporting community facing systematic persecution. 4. Sam Smith, non-binary visibility supporting trans community. Sam Smith's non-binary visibility and November trans advocacy demonstrates how gender non-conforming people support broader trans community. Grammy winner using platform amplifying trans voices while facing their own harassment, proving that anyone challenging cisgender norms faces violence that systematic gender policing enables through cultural enforcement of binary categories. Their September 2019 coming out as non-binary created visibility for gender identities beyond binary male-female. Sam explained, "I've been very nervous about announcing this because I care too much about what people think. Demonstrating courage required when visibility means accepting harassment that cisgender people never face, simply for existing authentically when society treats gender nonconformity as threat requiring punishment." Here's what makes Sam's trans advocacy particularly important despite them not identifying as trans. Their visibility challenges same rigid gender systems that target trans people, demonstrating that liberation requires dismantling binary categories rather than simply expanding which specific identities society tolerates, while maintaining systems requiring conformity to predetermined categories, limiting human gender expression to narrow acceptable options. The November TDUR participation spans multiple years, showing sustained solidarity. Sam attends vigils, speaks at events, donates to trans organizations, and uses social media platform amplifying trans voices, proving that authentic allyship from gender non-conforming people requires supporting trans community facing disproportionate violence when both communities challenge systems requiring cisgender conformity. But the harassment Sam faces demonstrates how violence targets anyone challenging gender norms. Their Grammy performance outfits, music videos, and public presentation face constant criticism from people uncomfortable with gender nonconformity, proving that systematic gender policing operates through cultural enforcement, punishing anyone refusing binary categories regardless of specific identity labels when actual threat is challenging rigid systems themselves. The they-them pronoun visibility normalized non-binary language use. Sam's consistent correction of media misgendering educated millions about respecting pronouns, demonstrating how celebrity visibility creates cultural change, enabling trans and non-binary people existing more safely when society slowly learns respecting gender identity through repeated exposure, normalizing what initially seems unfamiliar. Their music addressing gender and sexuality themes provided representation beyond binary narratives. Sam's songs exploring authentic identity created visibility for experiences that mainstream media systematically excludes, proving that art can serve liberation through representing marginalized experiences that commercial entertainment typically avoids when heteronormative and cisgender defaults dominate cultural production. But here's where Sam's advocacy demonstrates how non-binary and trans liberation interconnect. They don't claim speaking for trans community. They support trans people's own advocacy while addressing how their experiences connect to broader gender liberation, requiring dismantling systems harming everyone who challenges rigid categories, whether through being trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. The mental health discussions they've shared normalize struggles that gender non-conforming people face. Sam's openness about anxiety and pressure from public scrutiny educates audiences about psychological toll of constant visibility and harassment, demonstrating how discrimination destroys people's mental health when society treats authentic identity as acceptable target for abuse and mockery. The international platform creates global impact. Sam's visibility reaches audiences worldwide, including regions where trans and non-binary people face systematic persecution, creating representation that isolated individuals in conservative contexts can access through music and media when local communities provide no support or visibility for people challenging gender norms. Today, Sam Smith's November T2R participation and non-binary visibility demonstrates how challenging gender norms supports trans liberation. Their advocacy proves that dismantling rigid binary systems benefits everyone facing violence for refusing cisgender conformity, regardless of specific identity labels. When systematic gender policing targets all nonconformity, drop a 4. If you think Sam Smith's non-binary visibility proves that challenging gender norms supports trans liberation, and that dismantling rigid binary systems benefits everyone facing violence for refusing cisgender conformity. 5. Wilson Cruz, Decades of Trans Advocacy and GLAAD Leadership. Wilson Cruz leads November. Trans advocacy through GLAAD board position. My So-Called Life and Star Trek. Discovery actor using decades of visibility, supporting trans community through organizational leadership, requiring sustained commitment beyond celebrity statements when authentic solidarity demands institutional work-building systematic change. His GLAAD board service provides organizational infrastructure supporting trans media representation. Wilson's leadership ensures that trans stories receive accurate portrayal in entertainment, demonstrating understanding that visibility matters, but only when representations are authentic rather than stereotypical, when media shapes public perception, influencing whether society views trans people as fully human deserving rights or as curiosities and threats. Here's what makes Wilson's trans advocacy particularly significant across his career spanning 3 decades. He came out during My So-Called Life, 1994, becoming one of first openly gay actors on television when visibility carried enormous professional risk that current generation sometimes doesn't fully appreciate when career destruction was expected, consequence rather than exception. The November TDUR speeches he delivers emphasize intersectional solidarity. Wilson consistently connects how discrimination operates across different marginalized identities, demonstrating understanding that liberation requires addressing multiple systematic oppressions simultaneously rather than treating struggles as separate when actual people navigate multiple identities experiencing compounded discrimination. But his Star Trek Discovery role as Dr. Hugh Culber provided visible gay representation. While not trans representation specifically, Wilson's consistent visibility across decades created space for other marginalized actors, including trans performers, accessing opportunities that previous exclusion prevented when entertainment systematically limited who could appear on screen beyond stereotypical roles. The GLAAD organizational work demonstrates commitment to systematic change. Wilson's board service is an honorary position. He actively works developing media guidelines, consulting on trans representation, and building relationships with entertainment industry, ensuring that trans stories receive authentic telling. When actual institutional change requires ongoing work beyond individual performances or statements, his advocacy spans education and political organizing. Wilson speaks at universities, testifies before legislative bodies, and participates in campaigns opposing anti-trans legislation, demonstrating that entertainment platform creates opportunities for broader activism. When celebrities can access politicians and media that grassroots organizers struggle reaching despite doing crucial ground-level work. But here's where Wilson's decades of advocacy demonstrate sustained commitment that younger allies should study. He didn't stop activism after achieving personal success. His visibility and safety enable amplifying marginalized voices rather than retreating into comfortable celebrity life, ignoring ongoing struggles that his platform could help addressing when privilege creates responsibility for supporting communities facing discrimination. The mental health focus in his advocacy addresses suicide rates affecting trans youth. Wilson's consistent messaging about affirming environments saving lives educates audiences about how discrimination kills, proving that supporting trans people isn't abstract political position but life or death issue when family rejection and social stigma drive vulnerable youth to suicide that acceptance could prevent. The November visibility he maintains demonstrates understanding that TDUR isn't single-day commemoration. Wilson's year-round trans advocacy intensifies during November, proving that authentic solidarity requires sustained commitment, showing up during difficult grief moments rather than only celebrating during Pride when supporting community provides positive publicity. Today, Wilson Cruz's November TDOR leadership and GLAAD board service demonstrates how organizational work creates systematic change. His decades of advocacy prove that authentic allyship requires institutional commitment, building infrastructure supporting trans community beyond individual celebrity statements when liberation demands sustained collaborative work. Drop a 5 if you think Wilson Cruz's decades of trans advocacy proves that authentic allyship requires institutional commitment, and that cisgender allies must build systematic change infrastructure supporting trans community beyond individual celebrity statements. 5 cisgender allies. 5 different approaches proving that trans liberation requires sustained solidarity from those of us with relative privilege, not just during Pride celebrations, but especially during November, grief when we commemorate those lost to violence that systematic indifference enables through society, treating trans existence as disposable. Coleman connecting civil rights to trans liberation. George comparing internment to current persecution. Dan's sustained fundraising and visibility. Sam's non-binary advocacy challenging binary systems. Wilson's decades of organizational infrastructure building. The brutal truth? Trans people face disproportionate violence, while cisgender community often remains silent, prioritizing comfort over solidarity. November 20th demands that cisgender people, gay, straight, or otherwise, recognize that liberation is collective struggle requiring defending most vulnerable members rather than selectively supporting only identities that mainstream society tolerates. Which allies' approach matters most for your own activism? These aren't performative gestures. They're sustained commitments utilizing privilege, platforms, and resources, supporting community facing violence that cisgender silence enables through allowing scapegoating society normalizes when we don't speak up. Subscribe because trans liberation requires all of us. And November reminds us that silence is complicity when our siblings face violence that vocal opposition could help preventing through sustained political pressure and cultural accountability, demanding trans lives matter.